Got a lot to get through, so I'm going to get started here. This is a talk about code and what to do with it, so let's look at some. We've got a widget, right? We all know what this means. We've got a widgets table in our database. It's got a manufacturer, it's got some validations. Not important, just need a little backstory for this. So if you look up Rails controller in the dictionary, right, you find a picture of this source code. This is the most vanilla thing you could do. It kind of explains Rails. You can't be a Rails developer for too long without knowing this, right? So we're posting some parameters to our /widgets endpoint. We make a new widget we call save. Save will check validations. If they pass, it will write that data to the database, return true. We go to the widgets path. Cool. Validations fail, it won't write to the database, returns false, we re-render new, and there's some errors on the widget that populate the template, and the user can fix whatever they did wrong. So, right, is everybody's stuff this simple? Is everybody writing code that just writes validated data to the database? Everyone, right? So, no, right? I mean, sometimes we get to do that, and it starts off that way, but it always gets more complicated. We always have more stuff to do, right? So, like, you know, this widget company, right? What if we want to pre-order a bunch of widgets? So when we create one, we want to have some in the warehouse so that they're available. So this job will handle that, right? It's just, you know, we just queue this job and that's fine. But if we get an expensive widget, we don't want to just throw a bunch of laptops in our warehouse. We need to figure out what to do. So if there's something that's more than $1,000, we've got to like kind of dig in, like what is this thing? How many do we think we're going to sell? It's a very nebulous process. So when you have a nebulous process, what do? You email somebody and they figure it out. So that's what we do. Email the admin. Right, so we're the biggest widget company in the world, right? We're the W in FANG, but we used to be a startup. And when we were a startup, we had to work hard to get manufacturers on our platform. So those manufacturers we call legacy manufacturers. So if they make a widget, they don't do any of this. They do something else. We have our white glove salesperson handhold them through a process. So to do that, we put a row into the sales notifications table, and something else somewhere will figure out what to do. Okay. This is kind of more like it, right? Like maybe we wouldn't put this in the controller, maybe we wouldn't use these words or these if statements, but ultimately we have to do stuff like this, right? Like a user takes some action on the website and we've got to do a bunch of complicated, counterintuitive stuff that just needs to happen. We don't get to control the requirements of our application, so we kind of have to do whatever is needed. And one way or the other, right, this needs to happen when a widget gets created on our website. And so it's in the controller. Right? We probably all feel like it's probably not the right place. But I want to talk about like why. Like I like to know like why is this the wrong place? And I think a big reason is how do we test this code, right? So what is a controller? It's a thing that we don't instantiate. It has methods we don't call. Those methods don't take parameters, and the return value is ignored. It's kind of weird, right? So like that's not easy to test that. So you can do a system test. I don't know how you would test that through a browser, but maybe you could. It's slow and flaky and not good. You can do these integration tests, right? It used to be called controller test. They're kind of cumbersome and weird, and they let you post things to the controller that would never actually happen. You can probably all posted that Boolean to our controller in a test, and then the controller never gets a Boolean. It always gets a string. And the string false is truthy, so yeah, kind of a problem. So maybe we should move it somewhere where it's more easy to test. So another option, right? We have this widget active record. What if we put it in the after create callback, right? If you don't know what that is, basically it says after valid data is written to the database, but before it is shared with everyone else, run some code. And we're creating a widget, kind of seems reasonable, and the testing issue is solved, right? We could easily test this where it is, that's no problem. This is also not the best place for this code. Is it because active record callbacks are evil and gross? No, there's a real reason. There's two real reasons. One is related to testing. Again, all the other tests are now in a bad state, right? So all the other tests, if they have to have a widget in the database, they got to know about all this. Either they got to know to skip the callback or mock out all that business logic. Then if we change that business logic, the tests are going to break. And then you have tests that break when the code they're testing isn't broken. And who wants that, right? Nobody wants that. So that's a kind of practical problem. But there's also kind of a semantic problem. Right? Creating a widget on the website and inserting a row into the widgets table are different things. And so we've conflated them by using the callback. And it's probably not true that the business wants this logic run every time a row is inserted into the widgets database table. But if it were true, there are things other than Rails that can insert into the widgets database table. So the callback doesn't work for either case. It seems wrong. So that's kind of what we're talking about. So how do we sort this out? How do we figure out where is a better place for this code, right? So we're going to start from this piece of advice. This is the advice, if I could give one piece of advice to people who do Rails, it would be this. Just treat Rails what it is. Treat Rails for what it is, not what you might like it to be. So what does that mean? Here is our active record again. So this line of code says, I have a table called widgets in my database. I would like to do stuff with that table. That's what this does. Active record base. You can look at the code. It's all about database stuff. If you didn't have a widgets table, you would never write this code. So this is what this is. This is what the active record is. It says, I got a widgets table. I got to do stuff with it. This, though, we did this. We didn't have to do this. This didn't have to go there. We chose to make this active record maybe more than what it is to try to manage this code. Right? So active records are models of database tables. That's fine. They're great at that. They're really good at that. After create, you may think it's gross, but this, if you need to run code in the middle of all these database operations, like it's there. You can do that. That's what it's for. It's not for anything else. We could make it for something else, but we don't have to, right? So like controllers, if you want to respond to HTTP, you got to make a controller. The controller has to, no matter what else it does, it has to receive a request and generate a response. That's the whole reason it exists. Mailer, right? If you're not sending mail, why would you make a mailer? If you have a bunch of business logic to run and you put it in a job and then you don't call it in the background, that doesn't make sense. You wouldn't do that, right? A job is for running code in the background. But there's no thing for our business logic, right? This weird stuff that we have to make happen that doesn't exactly make sense, but we need to make it happen anyway. There is no like active business logic base or whatever. Like so where do we put this? So we've got all these great ideas. We've got some body shaming. We've got solid, which is terrible. We've got hexagons. Uncle Bob does things. Like these are all like not good. And they're not good because one, they're super vague and your team will argue about what these mean instead of getting their work done. And two, they create a lot of complexity when maybe you don't need it, right? Probably you know your app more than Uncle Bob, so go with that second maybe. Right, we're just talking about, well, where is code supposed to go? Well, where does Rails put our code? Maybe we'll start there, right? What does Rails do with our code? So it puts it by architectural component, right? There's no widgets place for all the widget-related stuff and manufacturer's place for all the manufacturer-related stuff. There's just like this, right? These are the building blocks of our app. We use these to build a feature. So every feature is going to need maybe a model, maybe a view, maybe a controller, and we bring this stuff together. That's how Rails organizes it. So when you see this, right, you probably don't want to do this. Some of us do. And again, why do we not want to do this? Because it's gross and we feel it's wrong? I mean, sure, but that's not, there's like a real reason that I think is important, right? What is this business logic that we've been looking at? So in this building somewhere is the greatest Rails developer who has ever lived, and you could hire them onto your team, and they have no idea how any of this works, right? Even if they worked at some other competing widget company, they create widgets different than us. They're not gonna know this stuff. So it's very esoteric knowledge that is hard to intuit and know in advance. It's also complicated and easy to forget, right? Like we've all had that experience where you're like, I remember how that feature works, and you go into the code, and you're like, it works kind of different. Who changed it? And it was you, right? It happens all the time. Because this stuff is just, it's hard to remember and it's just complicated. And of course it changes all the time, right? What happens more often? The business logic changes, a new edge case comes up, or you add a column to the database, right? This stuff changes all the time. The business learns new things it wants to do. Edge cases now need to be handled. We need to fix a performance problem. There's a bug, et cetera, et cetera. So why would you take this code that's hard to know in advance, easy to misremember, highly complicated, and changes frequently, and just put it all over the place, right? You wouldn't, because you're making your app harder to work on. Like when you need to make changes to your app, we all kind of get how views and controllers work, but the business logic, you got to relearn it sometimes completely before you can start changing it. And so it's nice if it's in one place, and it's bad if it's not in one place. Like it's hard to piece together what happens. So we don't want to do this. But we do this, right? Because we read some book about object-oriented programming, and it had the word model somewhere in the subtitle, and we're like, well, there's a models directory. We'll put it in there. That seems like the right place. And there's this vagueness in the first paragraph of the Rails guide. Now, this is the Rails guide for active records, right? Model is not anywhere in the table of contents of the Rails guide, but nevertheless, this is the first paragraph, right? Representing business data and logic, okay. Business objects whose data requires persistent storage. So it's kind of weird because it seems very specific, and yet it's not super clarifying. But this is just the first paragraph, right? We got all the rest of this guide is going to tell us what that means, right? But no, it doesn't. It's just stuff about a database. And that's fine. The active record is about databases. That's cool. It's fine. It's okay. So we don't. There's no reason to put our business logic in with our database stuff. Like there's no magical powers that it gets by doing that. Right? So this is what happens, right? App models, it contains models of data. It would be nice if it was called data models, I guess, but it's not. When you do bin Rails G model to make a new model, well, you make a thing to manage data in a database. It'd be nicer if it's a database model or something, but it doesn't. It just says this, and that's fine. So we're going to treat Rails for what it is. This is what actually happens. It's cool. Right? OK, so what we need to do then, maybe we manage it as its own architectural component. We looked at the parts of Rails. They're the building blocks of making our features come together. Well, our business logic is part of that. Let's do that. But it's not as much of a component as it's more like a layer or a seam, right? It creates a boundary between the gross strings and awfulness of HTTP and the low-level degenerate data types of your database. And in there is your stuff. And so you can make a seam to keep track of it. So that's kind of nice. So business logic layer, right? It's a bit of a mouthful, and not all of us are actually in business. So we know what business logic means, but it's not accurate. And so we want to be more accurate. So I'm going to say, right, you saw the title of the talk, service layer, the best term for most teams. Why? There's no way to conflate parts of Rails with services. If I say a service, you're not going to think I mean a controller. And maybe you did think that. And then we can have a quick conversation that is, when I refer to Rails things, I'll use the name. I'll say controller. When I say service, I mean everything else. Right? And then services don't mean anything else besides that, which is nice. Right? At the architectural level, it's nice where you have differentiation. You know what is what, but not over-prescribing what should be in there. Right? So cool. That's why I like that. So right, the title. Your service layer needn't be fancy. It just needs to exist. I had to use needn't to fit in the length of the title. But it sounds nicer, I guess. So right, we were just talking about like it needs to exist. So what does that mean? So I want to explore like what does it mean to deal with this in some way that's different than what we've seen? How do we make an unfancy service layer that just needs to exist? OK, so here's our controller. Back of the two options we've seen, this is the better one because this is triggered by the actual triggering event to run this logic. So it's here. But for reasons stated, we don't want it here. So what are we going to do? OK, so I dug into the Ruby programming language to try to find a feature that maybe would help us. And it's a feature that Rails developers don't use that often. It's called making a class and defining a method. So let's try that. So we'll make some class, make some method. It'll take the parameters, it'll do all the stuff, and it'll return the widget, and the controller can do whatever. So this is, right, it's a process of widget creation, so let's just call it that. That's a lot of widget in the first two lines of code, agreeably. You may have opinions. We'll get to those, but I will point out that the context in which you have a class and the context in which you call a method on that class aren't always the same. So even though this looks redundant and slightly silly, it's kind of nice if you have some object somewhere that's called blah and it calls create widget, and you're like, I think that might create widgets. And you might be able to find out where that comes from. That's kind of nice, right? Even though widget creation.new.createWidget params is a lot. We'll get to that. OK. So where do we put this code, right? Is we're going to put that class. Where does that class actually go? So there's this great Rails feature called makedir. So we can put it in services. And the great thing about this is Rails will auto-load anything in any directory and app that you make. It didn't used to always do that. You used to have to do some configuration. I don't know what version they fixed that. Whoever did that, thank you. This is great. So now there's no magical powers bestowed upon something going in models or views or controllers or whatever. You can get those powers too by just putting it there. Cool. And now we have all the building blocks to make any feature. Everything we need to make any feature is there. We need one or more of these things to put that together. Everything is in its place. There's not two things in one place. It's kind of nice, right? I think that makes sense. And then look at our controller. It's back to the dictionary picture, right? Our widget is like we get the parameters, and then we just send it off to the widget creation thing. It'll do whatever that means, and it'll return us a widget. And if it's valid, cool. If it's not, cool, right? So now our widget just has to worry about receiving a request and generating a response. That's nice. That's what we would like our widget to do, our widget's controller to do. We don't want it to do anything else. So now it doesn't do anything else, which is handy. OK, you probably have opinions. We will get to those opinions, but I want to talk about some facts first. Now, I'm from Washington, D.C., so I want to clarify these are true facts. So the widgets controller is stable with respect to widget creation, right? We can change the widget creation code all we want, and the widgets controller is highly unlikely to have to change. That's what stable means in this context. The active record, same deal. We can change the process around creating widgets radically, and the widget class probably not going to have to change it. I know it has a validation in it. We will talk about that, but generally also pretty stable. And those tests that we were talking about, any test that needs a widget inserted into the widgets database table, they're not going to have to change if we make changes to this widget creation thing. Like, that's good, right? We want a system in which tests break when the code they're testing is broken and not otherwise. So we've created a situation in which that's highly likely, which is good. And then we're a big widget company, so you got to imagine there's widget classes used everywhere, the instances of widget are everywhere. All that is, again, relatively stable with respect to this particular business process. So you could say, right, changes to the widget creation process are now well isolated from the rest of the system. I think this is a single responsibility principle, but I'm not super sure. So don't worry about it too much, but that might be what he was talking about. Okay, more facts. We haven't abstracted Rails away with clean architects or ports or hexagons, right? You can use everything in Rails that you want. Everything in the Rails guide, you can use it exactly how it says, right? We haven't said that you can't. You could totally do that. We have not banned any feature of Rails. If in your heart of hearts you really do truly need to run code after it's been data saved to the database, but before the transaction is committed, you can use the after create callback if you really, really need to. We're not banning anything, which is nice, right? Which means that everything you know about Rails, that hypothetical best Rails developer in the world, they're not going to be upset when they see this, because they can use every part of Rails that they want, which is nice. Okay, I didn't really say much about who I was, because it's not super interesting, but I will say this is not something that I was like, this will be a cool conference talk, I think I'll do it. Like, I have done this a lot at quote-unquote scale. The scare quotes are basically like, sometimes it was me, sometimes it was a small team, sometimes it was many teams. And I've seen code bases written this way grow for 4, 5 years. And I would encourage all of you, if you can arrange to have a job where you can stay there for 3 or 4 years, you will learn a lot about maintaining software that you'll never in a million years learn by working somewhere like 1 year or 18 months or 2 years, right? You'll learn a lot more because you'll face challenges that happen. And so I have been through that, and I was accountable, right? I made these decisions or was part of the decision-making process, and the teams that had to do this, you know, I was accountable for their output. So this is not something that I just thought would be neat to talk about. All right, so now there's a few things that we've got to reconcile. Those validations, right? Aren't they business logic? The code is ugly, and I hate it. And does it scale? So first things first. Yes, validations are a form of business logic. I mean, there's no way about it. And active model validations is a wonderful thing. I want to use it. It works great. It's had years of stability. It's awesome. It works great. I don't want to reinvent that. I don't want to do something else. I don't want to abandon that for this sort of architectural purity, right? Like, you know, it's a little bit of a trade-off. So yes, I would love to have our architectural principle be don't put business logic in your active records. But I think it's still pretty fine if we say except for validations, right? That's cool. With the asterisk that you can use the validations outside of active record. I don't know who did this, but thank you for doing this. That's very nice. So cool. Not too bad, right? When they say things are trade-offs or it all depends, well, this is a good example of a trade-off. I'd like architectural purity because it's simple and easy to follow, but I also would like this other thing, and so we're going to make a bit of a trade-off, and I think it's pretty easy to sort of justify and explain. Okay, so ugly code. Sorry, a doctrine against code that I find ugly and gross. I gotta be honest, like, I don't have a lot of sympathy for this particular argument. I feel like if you were saying, we value beautiful code, like, what does that mean? That means that in your process for writing software, you gotta have a step before you ship where you argue about if the code is beautiful enough to ship. Right? Now, realistically, what happens is you got one person in charge, and they set the standard of beauty, and then everyone else has to meet that standard of beauty. Why would you want this? Except for that one person in charge, you would not want this, right? This is making things harder and slower than they need to be. So I don't have a lot of sympathy for this. I do get it, right? We want widget.create to create widgets. That's what it sounds like it does. And I'm sorry, it doesn't. It inserts rows into the widgets database table. It just does, it's fine. I wish it was named something else. I wish it was named more clearly for what it does, but it's not. Okay, more true facts about the beauty, the ugliness of the code. It does not matter if your code is object-oriented. Rails is not very object-oriented if you think about it. But if this is important to you, there's a lot of definitions of object-oriented code. You can just go find the one that you want and use it. That's fine. It's okay if someone calls your code procedural, right? How many letters are in procedural? Are there 4 letters? No, there are not 4 letters in procedural. Sometimes a thing has to happen before another thing, and that's fine, totally fine. Right, does it scale? Of course, it's classes and methods. If classes and methods don't scale, then nothing scales, right? But the question, does it scale, other than disrupting meetings, that question is actually about what do you do when things get complicated? Do you have a plan for when things get complicated? Or have you thought through the implications of doing this more than just the code that fits in a slide on a conference talk? So that is a fair question. So here's what happens when you do this. So I said I have seen this, I have done this. So what happens is, as you can imagine, you get lots of these services. Every feature of your app will have a method, and it may have a method and a class, right? You could have a lot of these. And they're going to be complicated. Right, the business logic itself is complicated, so they have to have that. And then we don't always write the clearest code at the right time, so the code is going to be complicated, and there's going to be a lot of it. However, once you have some of these, you get this gift of knowing what your app actually does. You might think you know what your app should do, but once you see it actually working, then you know what it does. And I find it a lot easier to organize a thing that exists than to organize a hypothetical thing that I think may or may not exist. So we're talking about organizing code. Even though there may be periods of messiness, I think it's easier to organize things that are real, right? Even the least fancy thing that you do, which is kind of what I showed you, we'll make it obvious how to keep itself organized, because you're gonna have a bunch of services with names like widget creation and manufacturer onboarding and admin mail, whatever they're called, you'll see what your app does. So how do we manage this? This is the great thing, is these strategies are not fancy. Anyone who is a Rubyist either does or can learn these strategies, right? So we've seen this one, make a new class and make a method, and the method does the thing. So that's easiest. You can always do this always works and is fine. Sometimes you get a new use case that's kind of similar to another one, like maybe we want to import them from a CSV, and maybe there's some logic that needs to be shared between the two, so we'll put it in here, because they're kind of grouped maybe, okay, that's fine. And then if there actually is shared code, you can use the private method. I know some people don't like a private method, but this is amazing, right? Because you've got 2 public methods that are tested, and you made Dave Thomas happy and removed duplication into the private method that you don't have to test because it's covered, and no one will call it, or shouldn't call it. That's kind of nice. But if it gets too complicated, you can just extract that to its own service, and then widget creation calls the admin notifier service. What do you think the admin notifier does, right? It probably notifies admins. You know, that's a good guess. And then when you get a lot of them that seem like there's a bunch of services around a sort of shared theme, you can make a namespace and throw them in there. So this helps with naming and organization, and right, concepts that you discover, not concepts that you imagine in advance, right? Implied, you have to do tests. If you're not doing tests, this is the wrong talk, you're in trouble, you need to fix that. But if you have tests, right, all those agile dudes in there like ruthless refactoring, right, that's this. You can do all of that if you have tests. That's a benefit of the test. And at the end of the day, like renaming and moving code around is not that risky compared to other changes or other refactorings that you might want to make. But I don't want to tell you your business. You can OO up everything that you want inside your service layer. You can mix in and delegate and inherit all you want. Like, that's the beauty of the layer. It's a seam, and it is a defined interface between. And so on your side of that interface, use whatever you want. You can monad and function, whatever. You can put that in there too if you think that's going to solve your problems. And if you really do want to debate colons and hash rockets, you can do that too. It's kind of your service layer, however you want to do it. My experience, you aren't going to need all that stuff. I mean, a lot of it is not as beneficial as it might seem, but you can do it, right? That's a nice thing. You can decide how you want to organize that. Right, and so we're talking about, like, in terms of organizing for scale, to treat your app for what it is. So rather than sit back and imagine what it might be and think about domain concepts and we're going to need this operation and that operation, like, you can just look and see what it actually does and then have a way of organizing it as you go. It's a lot easier to do that than to do it in place, right? If you've ever had a dinner party, you get everything set up and then your kitchen is a mess later because you can't think through every possibility, but you can clean up. Cool. So right, treat Rails for what it is, not what you would like it to be. Rails is great. There's no reason to make it more than it's not. It has all the pieces you need to make your app very simple. Don't put business logic in your active records. If you take one thing away, please don't do that. It's not good. You're not going to be happy with that decision. Yeah, so that's kind of it. I can't believe I got through it faster than I practiced, but it's okay. I'm not hiring. I'd love to work with you. I'm just not hiring, though, but I have a book if you want to buy it. It talks about this in more detail. And there's a lot more stuff about Rails in there, too, that you might find interesting. It's 50% off, which means it's $25. I know that's a lot of money, so if you're from one of these other countries, there's a better code that prices it more along the lines of what things cost for you. I did not expect to have time for questions, but I do if anyone has a couple questions. Yeah, have I found patterns that grow out of services? Yes, definitely. So like we saw an example of extracting a private method into a service, and now service 1 depends on service 2. And so you end up writing like, def admin mailer, add admin mailer, blah, blah. You end up writing that a lot. So like I have a thing that like makes that easy. I have a base service that has a bunch of like logging and request tracing, stuff like that. But all of that, like, I think some of it is generally useful to anyone, but most of it was like, I just looked at what was going on. I'm like, all right, I've done this like 4 times. I think I can like, abstract this away. But sometimes not, though. I had another developer working with me, and she would be like, I don't think that makes sense. And so like, there is some stuff that still, weren't super confident, but it definitely will happen. Yes. Yeah, why not make everything callable, use the call method? I did have a whole section on that. I had to cut it for time, so I'm glad that you asked. I find it confusing when every method in my app is the same name. So that's me. I think there's a less snarky answer, which is, you saw that I was making methods, so to call these methods, you got to instantiate the class, right? A lot of people will want to do like widgets creation dot create widget or dot call, and the problem then is if you need another method, what are you going to call it? Call to? I mean, that's not going to work. Like if you say it's call, then you get one method, that's it. So I don't, but if you need the command pattern, right? That's why people do that. Like if I want to create my thing separately from where I'm calling it, that's the command pattern. So you would do that. Except in Rails, the command pattern is background jobs. So again, I don't think you really need call, my opinion. Yeah, how much testing to do of the controller about how the thing is invoked. I would write a controller test if it was complicated and I couldn't figure out another way, but I tend to either, if I can test it through as part of the feature system test, that's good. But I just gave you a rant about writing tests, but tests are a trade-off too. Like too many tests can be negative, so it's a little bit of a judgment call. But most of them, the service invocations are pretty simple in my experience. But that's just my experience. Yes. Right. Yeah. Where does authorization go? If it was in the controller, which is pretty logical, do you also move it into the service, and is there duplication? I don't put it into the service. I try to write the services as if they are okay to have been called. I guess if it was like super important that it not be called with the wrong authorization, I might check on a case-by-case basis. I don't actually know now, speaking about it, if that's like the right thing to do, because you could imagine getting a lot bigger and complicated, and people may not know that this service can't be called by someone without authorization. So I think it depends on the sensitivity of your authorization system. It's kind of a wishy-washy answer, sorry. Scopes, yeah, do I use scopes? So scopes are, there's nothing magic, right? You can do def self dot whatever, and it's the same as a scope. So I don't use scopes. I do make methods like that, but in my mind, like I put stuff in the active record that is about the database itself. So if we all have like those tables that have like the status field, and you don't want to have the strings of the different statuses all over your code base. So I would put that in the active record because it knows about the database. It's like the database says the status values are X, Y, and Z, so the active record can like manage that. But I wouldn't make a scope that is like business logic-y, like widgets.best widgets. Like I wouldn't do that because that's business logic. I'd put that in, you can probably guess, best widget searcher or something, right? Yeah. Right, presentational stuff. Yeah, I didn't have time to go into this, but I have a lot of resources, right? If you active model.model, I mean, I went on this rant about models, but it is nice and you can make a resource. So I have like a zillion resources. So I almost never have a resource that is like the active record. I view those as like a thing to deal with the database, but like my UI is probably not gonna be exactly like the active record, so I'll make a resource for that and then maybe have a service that like maps one to the other if it's complicated. It kind of depends, but I try to keep that stuff wrapped up in like active model models or plain old structs or something like that. Cool. All right, so that's time. Thank you. Come up and talk to me. And if you are from another country, I'd love to give you one of these. Thank you.